On the 6th of April, 1453, the inhabitants of Constantinople awoke to the thunder of drums. The Turkish army of Sultan Mehmed II had approached the walls of a city that had been considered impregnable for 1,000 years. 80,000 Ottoman soldiers set up camp before the ancient fortifications, erected during the reign of Emperor Theodosius II. Green banners with crescents fluttered above the tents, and the air was thick with the smoke of thousands of campfires. 21-year-old Sultan Mehmed gazed at the massive walls with cold determination. He was called the Fatih, the Conqueror, though that title had yet to be earned. Constantinople had been his obsession since he first ascended the throne at age 13. His father, Murad II, had abdicated, but the boy sultan failed to manage the vast empire, and his father had to return. Now, after Murad's death, Mehmed had a second chance to prove his greatness, and he was not about to miss it. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos convened a military council in the Great Palace. The 9-year-old ruler of the once great Byzantine Empire looked at the map with bitterness. Of the vast state that had stretched from Spain to Syria, only a few kilometers of walls remained around the capital. Everything else had been swallowed by the Turks over the last 200 years. His brothers, Thomas and Demetrios, held the Peloponnese, but they were too far away and too weak to come to his aid. A few islands in the Aegean Sea, that was all that remained of the empire of the Romans. There were about 7,000 defenders in the city. Constantine walked every section of the wall, personally counting the soldiers. 5,000 Byzantines and 2,000 mercenaries, Genoese and Venetians. Among them stood out Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, the famous Genoese condottiero who had arrived with 700 elite fighters. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar across his face, Giustiniani had already defended many fortresses against the Turks. Constantine appointed him commander of the land defense, which caused dissatisfaction among the Byzantine nobility. But the emperor was adamant. The time for aristocratic intrigues had passed. It was a matter of survival. The walls of Constantinople stretched for 22 kilometers, surrounding the city on 3 sides. To the east, they were washed by the Bosphorus, to the north by the Golden Horn, and to the south by the Sea of Marmara. The most powerful fortifications were on the western landward side, the primary line of defense built 1,000 years ago. In the 1,100 years of the city's existence, it had been attacked 23 times. All attempts had failed, but never before had such an army approached the walls, and never before had there been so few defenders. Mehmed had brought with him something that would change everything. Cannons, not ordinary bombards, but monstrous weapons cast by a Hungarian master named Urban. This engineer had first offered his services to Emperor Constantine, but the emperor could not pay the requested price. Urban then went to the Turks. Mehmed did not just pay. He gave the Hungarian everything necessary to create the largest cannons in the world. The main weapon, named Basilica, had a barrel over 9 meters long and fired stone cannonballs weighing about 300 kilograms. The sound of the shot could be heard from 20 kilometers away, and the ball shattered a wall a meter thick. The delivery of these monsters to Constantinople took 2 months. When the residents saw the Turks installing the bombards opposite the walls, many realized, this time, everything will be different. Old men recalled their grandfathers' stories of previous sieges, when Greeks poured Greek fire onto attackers from high walls. Now, the height of the walls had become a disadvantage, huge targets for the Turkish cannons. Constantine knew his only hope was to wait for help from the west. He sent messengers to Venice, Genoa, Rome, and the kings of Aragon and Hungary. The Byzantine emperor even agreed to a union with the Catholic Church, which sparked fury among the Orthodox population. On December 12 of the previous year, a Latin Mass was held in the Hagia Sophia. Many Byzantines perceived this as betrayal. The Grand Duke Lucas Notaras, a high-ranking imperial official, uttered words that flew throughout the city. Better to see the Turkish turban reigning in the city than the Latin tiara. But Constantine saw no other way. The West possessed the money and the armies. The West could save Constantinople. Help arrived slowly and sparingly. The Venetian Senate, after long debates, allocated 2 ships. The Genoese of the Galata colony, located directly across the bay, officially declared neutrality. The Pope sent Cardinal Isidore with 200 soldiers and promises that no one believed. The King of Aragon, Alfonso V, promised a fleet, but the ships never appeared. The Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick III, sent a letter of condolences and advice to hold on. Constantine was left one-on-one with the Turkish army. In the final weeks before the siege, the city lived in a feverish state of preparation. Women and children carried stones to patch breaches in the walls. Monks melted down church plate for weapons. Merchants hid goods in basements. Fishermen dragged their boats ashore and joined the defenders. On April 6, the last doubts vanished. The Turkish army camped from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn, blocking all land routes. A fleet of more than 130 ships, commanded by Admiral Baltaolu Suleiman Bey, blockaded the city from the sea. Heavy cannons took positions opposite the most vulnerable sections of the wall at the Gate of Street, Romanus, the Corinthian Gate, and in the Lycus River Valley. Mehmed set up his tent on a hill opposite the Street Romanus Gate, from where he could watch the progress of the siege. Beside him were the 7 viziers and the Aga of the Janissaries, commanders of the Sultan's elite infantry. Constantine also divided the defense into sectors. He, along with Giustiniani, took position at the Street Romanus Gate, where the main strike was expected. The Bocchiardi brothers' Genoese captains Paolo, Antonio, and Troilo were given command of the northern section along the Golden Horn. The Venetian Girolamo Minato was responsible for the imperial palace and adjacent fortifications. The Catalan Peri Giulia defended the Studian monastery district. Prince Orhan, a Turkish pretender to the throne who had fled to the Byzantines, took his men to the wall by the Blacherne Palace. Each commander knew the fate of the city depended on him. On the evening of April 5, the eve of the siege, a final solemn service took place in the Hagia Sophia. The emperor and the entire court attended the liturgy. Catholics and Orthodox forgot their discord in this hour. Ancient mosaics of Christ Pantocrator and the Mother of God watched over the worshippers from the height of the immense dome. The light of thousands of candles reflected in the gold of the iconostasis. The choir sang ancient Byzantine hymns that had echoed within these walls for 600 years. Many wept, sensing this might be the last service in the greatest cathedral of the Christian world. After the service, Constantine walked among the congregation, asking forgiveness from all he might have offended. Then he returned to the palace, from where he left for the walls an hour later. All night, he rode along the fortifications, checking the readiness of the defenders. At dawn on April 6, the first volley of Turkish cannons rang out. The siege had begun, a siege destined to change the course of world history. The earth shook from the roar. A stone cannonball slammed into the wall at the Street Romanus Gate, throwing up a cloud of dust and debris. Defenders on the towers ducked, covering their heads. A few minutes later, a second ball struck. Then a third. Basilica fired slowly. After each shot, it had to be cooled with water and reloaded, a process taking 2 hours. But the other cannons kept up a continuous fire. The Turks had 69 guns of varying caliber, and they all aimed at the western wall. Giustiniani organized repair crews. As soon as the cannons fell silent at sunset, the Turks did not fire at night for fear of damaging their own guns. In the dark, defenders descended into the moats and filled the breaches. They dragged stones from destroyed buildings, assembled wooden shields, and filled sacks with earth and sand. By dawn, the breaches disappeared, and the Turks had to start over. This exhausting labor continued every night. Men collapsed from fatigue, but the emperor personally came to the work crews, helping to carry stones and logs, encouraging the weary. On the 5th day of the siege, the first serious clash occurred. Turkish infantry attempted to storm the walls where the cannons had opened a significant breach. Bashi bazooks, irregular troops recruited from across the empire, were the first to run to the walls with ladders and hooks. Behind them came Anatolian soldiers in quilted armor, armed with spears and sabers. The defenders met them with a hail of arrows, stones, and boiling resin. Genoese crossbowmen fired from a distance of 100 meters, piercing armor with ease. Greeks dropped huge boulders from the walls, which rolled down the slope, crushing the attackers. Giustiniani personally directed the counterattack. When several Turks managed to climb the wall, he, with a sword in hand, led a group of Genoese and threw the attackers down. The condottiero fought in full armor despite the April heat. His voice thundered above the walls, shouting commands in Italian, Greek, and even Turkish. The attack died out after 2 hours. The Turks retreated, leaving hundreds of bodies beneath the walls. The Byzantines lost 20 men killed and about 50 wounded. It was a victory, but everyone understood. The real storm was yet to come. Mehmed was not in a hurry. He methodically destroyed the walls with cannons, saving the lives of his best soldiers. The Janissaries, the elite infantry, the Sultan's personal guard, had not yet participated in the attacks. These professional soldiers, taken as children from Christian peasant families, converted to Islam, and trained in the art of war, were Mehmed's main trump card. 12,000 Janissaries stood in reserve, waiting for the decisive assault. They lived in a separate camp, received double pay, and were considered the best infantry in the world. Their white felt caps with long cloth tails stood out among the colorful crowd of the Turkish army. At sea, a struggle was also underway. The entrance to the Golden Horn was blocked by a massive chain stretched between Constantinople and the Genoese colony of Galata. Enormous iron links, as thick as a man's arm, were held up by wooden rafts and prevented Turkish ships from entering the bay. This meant the northern wall of the city remained inaccessible to sea attacks. Baltaulu Suleiman Bey tried several times to break the chain, but Byzantine ships beat back the attacks. On April 20, an event occurred that gave hope to the defenders. 4 large ships appeared on the horizon, sailing toward the city with a favorable wind. 3 Genoese galleys were carrying weapons and provisions sent by the Pope. The 4th vessel was Byzantine. The emperor had sent it to search for the Venetian fleet that had promised to come. The ship was returning empty-handed, but it carried grain bought in Sicily. The Turkish fleet tried to intercept the vessels. 145 Turkish ships surrounded the 4 Christian ones. Baltaulu Suleiman Bey was confident of an easy victory. The battle began right at the city walls. Thousands of people stood on the fortifications and the shore, watching the engagement. Mehmed personally rode his horse into the water, shouting commands, promising to take the admiral's head if he let the Christian ships escape. Turkish galleys surrounded the large vessels in a tight circle, showering them with arrows and trying to board. But the high hulls of the Genoese and Byzantine ships made boarding almost impossible. The Turks climbed ropes and poles, while the defenders struck them down with spears and axes. The sea around the ships turned red with blood. Suddenly, the wind died down. The Turkish oared galleys gained the advantage. They could maneuver, while the sailing ships stood still. Baltaulu Suleiman Bey ordered his flagship to ram. The heavy galley gathered speed and crashed into the side of a Genoese ship. The impact was so great that the Turkish vessel split in half and began to sink. The admiral managed to transfer to another ship, but the loss of the flagship in front of the Sultan was a humiliation. The attacks continued until evening. By sunset, a north wind picked up, and the 4 ships, to the cheers of the defenders, broke through to the chain. It was lowered, the ships entered the Golden Horn, and the chain was raised again. Mehmed was furious. He summoned Baltaulu Suleiman Bey and ordered him to be beaten with sticks. The admiral was beaten so severely he barely survived, was stripped of all his property, and expelled from the army. The Sultan realized the naval blockade was insufficient. He needed to get the fleet into the Golden Horn and attack the weak northern wall. But how to bypass the chain? The viziers proposed various plans. One advised building a pontoon bridge to transport troops across the bay. Another suggested using divers to destroy the chain underwater. A third wanted to burn it with Greek fire, the recipe for which the Turks had recently stolen from the Byzantines. Mehmed chose the most daring plan: drag the ships over land. On the night of April 22, the Turks cleared a path through the hill from the Bosphorus to the Golden Horn. The path, 2 kilometers long, was paved with wooden planks soaked in fat and oil. 70 galleys, fustas, and brigantines were hauled ashore. Rollers made of logs were placed under each hull. Thousands of men pulled them with ropes, while oxen pushed from behind. Sails were raised on the masts, creating the illusion that the ships were sailing across the land. A brass band played marches, and drummers kept the rhythm. By the morning of April 23, 70 Turkish ships were in the Golden Horn. The defenders woke up and saw the enemy fleet behind their backs. Now they had to defend not only the western wall but also the northern one, stretching their already meager forces thin. Constantine convened a war council. The Venetians proposed a daring plan: burn the Turkish ships in a night attack. Under the command of Giacomo Cocco, 70 rowers on boats were to approach the Turkish vessels under cover of darkness, with barrels of Greek fire. On the deep night of April 28, the Venetian boats moved toward the Turkish ships, but someone had warned the Turks perhaps a defector from the Genoese Galata, which officially maintained neutrality but secretly helped Mehmed. Turkish guard ships were waiting in ambush. When the Venetians approached closely, A hail of arrows and stones descended upon them. Several boats caught fire from their own Greek fire. The rest retreated in panic. 40 Venetians were captured. Mehmed ordered them beheaded in front of the city's defenders. The heads were impaled on stakes and displayed along the shore of the Golden Horn. It was a demonstration of power and cruelty. By the beginning of May, the city walls were in ruins in many places. The Lycus River Valley, where the wall was lower due to the terrain, suffered the most. The Turkish cannons concentrated their fire on this section. Basilica fired day and night. Although after every 7th shot it began to crack from overheating, Urban constantly repaired his brainchild. But in late April, the giant cannon finally split, killing the master himself and several of his assistants. However, the other guns continued the bombardment. The defenders had repelled 8 assaults. Each time the Turks retreated, suffering heavy losses. But the strength of the Byzantines was also melting away. Hospitals lacked doctors and medicine. The wounded were placed in churches and monasteries. Women cared for them, tearing their own clothes into bandages. Food supplies were dwindling. Constantine ordered rationing. Each family received a specific amount of bread, cheese, and wine. The rich shared with the poor. The city lived in a state of remarkable unity, in the face of common danger. At night, people gathered in churches to pray. They particularly venerated the icon of the Mother of God Hodegetria, which, according to legend, was painted by the evangelist Luke. The icon was carried in a procession around the walls, asking for protection. On May 7, the procession stopped when the icon was accidentally dropped. This was taken as a bad omen. That evening, a terrible thunderstorm with hail began. Lightning struck several churches. The next day, such a thick fog hung over the city that one could not see a person 3 steps away. When the fog cleared, witnesses swore they saw a strange glow over the dome of the Hagia Sophia, which rose into the sky and vanished. Monks whispered, "The Lord has left the city." Constantine did not believe in omens. He believed in the courage of his men and hoped for a miracle help from the West. But weeks passed, and no help came. On May 12, the emperor gathered his last war council. Scouts reported, "The Turks are preparing a decisive assault." Mehmed ordered the moats before the walls to be filled. Thousands of Christian prisoners, shackled in chains, hauled sacks of earth and stones, filling the moats. Many were killed by the defenders' arrows, but the Turks drove more and more captives forward. By mid-May, the moats had been filled along the entire extent of the western wall. Now nothing stopped the Turks from approaching the walls directly. Mehmed scheduled the assault for May 29, the feast day of St. Theodosius. The Sultan believed in favorable dates. He toured the troops and promised every soldier who first scaled the wall that he would be made governor of a wealthy province. Anyone who captured the imperial palace was promised untold treasures. The Sultan promised the entire army 3 days of looting, the traditional reward for taking a city by storm. The Turkish soldiers cheered, anticipating the spoils. Constantinople was considered the richest city in the world, although this had long since ceased to be true. But the legends of gold and treasures stirred their imaginations. On May 27, the Turks declared a day of rest and prayer. Throughout the camp, mullahs read sermons, calling the warriors to jihad, a holy war against the infidels. In the evening, thousands of fires and torches were lit. The Turkish camp was so bright it seemed the entire horizon was burning. Drums, flutes, and zurnas played until dawn. Soldiers sang and danced, exciting themselves before the battle. In Constantinople, on this illuminated night, no one slept either. People stood silently on the walls, looking at the lights of the enemy camp, understanding that tomorrow their fate would be decided. On May 28, Constantine ordered all city gates closed. Each was barred from within with wooden beams and blocked with stones. From then on, it was impossible to leave the city. The defenders had to win or die. The emperor rode around all sections of the walls for the last time. Speaking to each detachment, he spoke simply, without flowery words, reminding them they were defending not only their homes and families but their faith, the last bastion of Christianity in the East. He said that for 1,000 years these walls had stood unshakable, and tomorrow they must stand again. By evening, the entire city gathered in the Hagia Sophia. The massive basilica, which could hold 10,000 people, could not accommodate everyone who wanted to enter. People stood outside on the square and neighboring streets. Catholic and Orthodox priests served the liturgy together, forgetting all their discord. The emperor received communion from the hands of Cardinal Isidore. Next to him stood Giustiniani and other commanders, Genoese, Catholics, Venetians, Greeks, Orthodox, Catalans all prayed side by side. After the service, Constantine returned to the Blockernay Palace. He gathered his courtiers and personally said goodbye to each, asking forgiveness for all grievances. Then he changed into simple armor, removed all imperial insignia, and set off for the walls. He took only a sword, a shield, and a horse. Constantine took his position at the street Romanus Gate, where the main strike was expected. Beside him stood Giustiniani with his Genoese. In the Turkish camp, Mehmed gathered his war council. The Sultan had developed a detailed assault plan. The attack would come in 3 waves. First, the Bashi Bazouks, irregular troops, poorly armed and untrained. Their task was to exhaust the defenders, forcing them to use up arrows and gunpowder. The second wave, Anatolian warriors, professional soldiers with siege experience. They were to expand the breaches made by the first wave. And finally, the Janissaries, the elite of the army. They were to strike the decisive blow and break into the city. Mehmed personally directed the deployment of troops. His personal guard, 12,000 Janissaries under the command of Aga Hassan, stood opposite the street Romanus Gate. To the right, at the Parisian Gate, the warriors of Ishak Pasha were positioned. To the left, along the Sea of Marmara, stood the soldiers of Karaja Pasha. Reserve units occupied positions in the rear. The fleet in the Golden Horn and the Bosphorus received orders to begin artillery fire on the northern and eastern walls, simultaneously with the storming of the western wall. The Sultan gave the defenders no chance to concentrate their forces in one area. At midnight, the Turkish camp plunged into silence. The warriors rested, gathering strength before the battle. Mullahs circled the tents, reading prayers over the sleeping. Officers checked weapons and armor. On the walls of Constantinople, a strange silence also reigned. The defenders stood at their posts, staring into the darkness. Here and there torches burned, illuminating sections of the wall. Women brought food and wine, distributed arrows, spears, stones, and checked the supplies of Greek fire and gunpowder. Giustiniani toured his section, encouraging the men. An experienced soldier, he had participated in 20 sieges and knew that the hardest part was the waiting before the fight. He joked with the soldiers, told stories of past battles, and shared wine from his flask. The Genoese loved their commander and were ready to follow him into hell. Many of them were veterans of the Italian wars and had faced death more than once. But even hardened fighters felt anxiety. The inequality of forces was simply too great. The Venetians on their section of the wall prepared a special surprise. Girolamo Minotto ordered several small cannons to be installed on the towers along the Sea of Marmara. These light guns, brought on Venetian ships, could fire grape-shot a multitude of small lead bullets. They were deadly effective against dense infantry formations. The Venetians also prepared a reserve of Greek fire, an incendiary mixture based on oil that burned even on water. The recipe had been kept under strict secrecy for centuries, and the Turks dreamed of capturing it. The Greek militia, standing between the professional mercenaries, were less confident. Most of them had never held a weapon before the start of the siege, but they were defending their homes, their wives, and their children. This gave them a strength the Turkish warriors, fighting for loot, lacked. Among the Greeks circulated the legend of the Marble Emperor. It was said that when the city fell, an angel would save the last ruler, turning him into marble and hiding him in a secret place under the city. When the time came, the emperor would wake up and return Constantinople to the Christians. This legend consoled people in their darkest hours. On the ships in the Golden Horn, they also prepared for battle. The crews slept in shifts. Half remained awake, ready to repel an attack. Barrels of water were placed on the decks to extinguish fires. Oars were checked they might need to maneuver quickly. Captains discussed plans for mutual support. If the Turks broke through on any section of the northern wall, the ships were to approach and land reinforcements. Each vessel carried extra fighters for this purpose. In the city churches, the services did not stop. Monks read psalms and akathists, asking for divine protection. In the Kora monastery, monks prayed before famous mosaics depicting the Last Judgment. In the Church of the Holy Apostles, where the tombs of Byzantine emperors from Constantine the Great to Manuel II were located, priests served requiems, calling on the spirits of the ancestors to protect the city. Holy fools wandered the streets, shouting prophecies, Some predicted imminent victory, others ruin and destruction. Lucas Notaras, the Grand Duke, stood on the wall of his palace and looked at the lights of the Turkish camp. He was 68 years old. He had served 4 emperors and witnessed the gradual decline of the empire. Once, Byzantium had stretched from Gibraltar to the Euphrates, controlling the richest lands of the Mediterranean. Now, only this city and a few islands remained. Notaras had spent his whole life opposing the union with the Catholics, believing it better to perish as Orthodox than to be saved by betraying the faith. Now, looking at the approaching catastrophe, he pondered whether this had been a mistake. Maybe he should have accepted the Latin tiara if it would have saved the city. In the poor districts of the city, ordinary people gathered in families in their small houses. Mothers hid children in basements, hoping the Turks would not find them there. Old men retrieved hidden savings, a few gold coins, and sewed them into their clothes, thinking they could buy their way out from the invaders. Young men said goodbye to their wives and went to the walls, realizing they might be seeing them for the last time. Girls wept, begging them not to leave. Everyone knew what awaited the women of a captured city. In the Genoese Galata, on the opposite shore of the Golden Horn, residents watched the unfolding events with mixed feelings. Formally, the colony was neutral. The Podesta, the head of the administration, had concluded an agreement with Mehmed, pledging not to help Constantinople. In exchange, the Sultan promised not to touch Galata after the capture of the city, but many Genoese secretly sympathized with the defenders. Some of them moved to Constantinople and stood on the walls next to Giustiniani. Their families remained in Galata, not knowing if they would see their husbands and sons again. Around 2:00 a.m., the first signal sounded, the long, mournful howl of Turkish trumpets. It was a preliminary signal, warning the troops of the approaching assault. The defenders on the walls tensed. Then silence followed, lasting another hour. In this silence, one could hear the beating of a heart. People whispered prayers, clutched their weapons, and stared into the darkness where the enemy army lay concealed. Somewhere a child cried. Somewhere a dog barked. These ordinary sounds seemed piercing in the pre-dawn silence. Constantine stood at the street Romanus gate, leaning on his sword. Nearby was Giustiniani, in his bright armor. A little further away was the Spanish grandee Francisco de Toledo, and hundreds of Catalan knights. Further along the wall were the Bocchiardi brothers with the Genoese, Theophilos Palaiologos, a distant relative of the emperor with the Greek militia, and Prince Orhan with his Turkish defectors. Each knew his place. Each was ready to die there. The emperor once again toured the nearest positions, spoke a few words to each commander, embraced Giustiniani, then returned to his post and began to wait. The first wave rolled onto the walls like a sea surf. 20,000 Bashi bazooks ran toward the fortifications with cries of Allahu Akbar. These were peasants and urban poor from Anatolian villages, Balkan adventurers, former robbers, and pirates. Their equipment was motley. Some had a saber, some a spear, some just a club. Almost none had armor. They were driven into the attack by threats and promises of loot. Officers rode behind with drawn swords, ready to strike down those who retreated. The defenders met the attackers with organized fire. Crossbowmen fired in volleys. Each arrow found a target in the dense mass of attackers. Greek archers showered the Turks with a hail of arrows. Boulders and logs were dropped from the towers, rolling down the slope and knocking down dozens of people. Those who dragged ladders to the walls placed them against the fortifications and began to scramble up. The defenders overturned the ladders with long poles, poured boiling resin and oil, and dropped red-hot sand that seeped under clothing and armor, burning the skin. The attack lasted 2 hours. The Bashi bazooks stormed the walls with desperate courage, born of fear of their own commanders. Several times they managed to climb onto the wall, but each time Giustiniani and his Genoese launched a counterattack and threw the breakthrough forces down. The condottiero was everywhere. His tall figure in shiny armor flashed here and there along the wall. He fought with sword and axe, encouraged weary soldiers, and personally plugged gaps in the defense. Beside him fought Emperor Constantine, having cast off all signs of royal dignity, fighting like a common soldier. By 6:00 a.m., the first wave was exhausted. The Turks retreated, leaving thousands of bodies beneath the walls. Mehmed did not give the defenders a reprieve. Barely had the Bashi bazooks rolled back when the second wave moved forward the Anatolian troops under the command of Ishak Pasha. These were professional soldiers, dressed in quilted armor, armed with spears, sabers, and shields. They advanced in organized detachments, carrying long storming ladders and portable shelters that protected them from arrows. In front ran sappers with pickaxes and crowbars, tasked with dismantling the breaches filled in during the night. The Anatolians attacked methodically and professionally. They set up ladders simultaneously along a large stretch of the wall, preventing the defenders from concentrating their strength in one place. Archers covered the storming party, firing at embrasures and loopholes. Under the cover of the shelters, the sappers crept up to the breaches and began to dismantle the obstacles. Giustiniani realized the danger and personally led a sortie. 100 Genoese descended from the wall and struck the sappers. A ferocious hand-to-hand fight erupted in the moat before the wall. The battle was brutal Italian swords against Turkish sabers, European training against Eastern fury. Giustiniani fought in the front ranks. His sword knew no misses, but there were too many Turks. Reinforcements were arriving from all sides, threatening to surround the Genoese. The condottiero ordered a retreat. His men, covering each other, withdrew to the wall and climbed up on ropes. The losses were heavy. About 30 men remained lying in the moat. The Anatolian attack continued until 8:00 a.m. The Turks almost broke through the wall several times, but each time they were thrown back. An especially fierce battle raged at the Corinthian Gate, where the wall was heavily damaged by cannons. Here, the defenders were commanded by the emperor's brother, Theophilos Palaiologos. His detachment of 200 Greeks held their ground with incredible courage against thousands of Turks. When arrows ran out, the Greeks threw stones. When the stones ran out, they fought with swords and spears. When weapons broke, they fought with their bare hands. Finally, Ishak Pasha ordered a retreat. His troops had suffered huge losses, more than 3,000 killed and wounded, but they had fulfilled their task. They had exhausted the defenders and forced them to use up their ammunition. Now it was the Janissaries' turn. The Sultan's elite guard lined up before the street, Romanus Gate in perfect order, 12,000 warriors in white felt caps, dressed in identical yellow kaftans, armed with yatagans, bows, and arquebuses. In the front walked Aga Hassan with the Prophet's huge banner, a green cloth with gold embroidery. Mehmed personally led the Janissaries. The Sultan rode his white horse into the first ranks, raised his sword above his head, and shouted, "Forward, lions of Islam! Paradise is open for those who fall in jihad." The Janissaries moved silently in orderly ranks, to the beat of drums and the sound of trumpets. They did not run like the Bashi bazouks, and they did not rush like the Anatolians. They walked at a measured pace, as if on parade, holding their formation. It was a terrifying sight. Thousands of identical figures moving as a single organism, ruthless and unstoppable. On the walls, the defenders clutched their weapons. They were exhausted by 5 hours of continuous battle. Arrows were nearly gone. Gunpowder for the cannons was running low. Many were wounded. Some barely stood on their feet from fatigue. But Emperor Constantine rode along the fortifications, shouting, "Hold, brothers! This is the last attack. Another hour and they will retreat." Giustiniani stood at the street, Romanus Gate, leaning on his sword. Blood trickled from several wounds on his arms and legs, but the condottiero paid them no mind. He encouraged his Genoese, reminding them of the glorious victories of the past. The Janissaries approached the wall and began the assault with professional precision. Archers showered the fortifications with arrows. Arquebusiers fired from primitive weapons. Smoke and thunder were such that one could not tell who was friend and who was foe. The assault groups placed ladders in dozens of places at once. Janissaries climbed up. The defenders threw them down. But for every fallen man, another followed. It was a battle of attrition, and the Turks had an enormous numerical advantage. In the heat of the battle, a misfortune occurred that sealed the city's fate. Around 9:00 a.m., Giustiniani was wounded. An arbalist bolt or a bullet, sources differ, pierced his armor and entered his chest. The condottiero fell. His squires caught him. Giustiniani screamed to be carried out of the fight. Emperor Constantine rushed to him, pleading with him to stay. The departure of the commander in the heat of battle would demoralize the troops, but the wounded Genoese could not continue the fight. He was carried to the ships in the Golden Horn. The Genoese, seeing their commander leaving the wall, faltered. Some ran after him. Panic began to spread. Constantine understood. This was the end. But the emperor decided to die as befitted a basileus of the Romans. He threw off his purple mantle so enemies would not recognize him and threw himself into the thick of the fight. Next to him were his faithful companions, Don Francisco de Toledo and Theophilos Palaiologos. They fought at the street Romanus gate when the Turks poured through the wall. The exact circumstances of the emperor's death are unknown. His body was never found. The last words overheard by witnesses were, "Is there no Christian who will cut off my head?" He did not want to fall into the hands of the Turks. Almost simultaneously, another fatal event occurred. A small postern gate, the Kerkaporta, in the northern part of the wall, used for sorties, was left unlocked. Someone among the defenders had forgotten to close it after the night round. A group of janissaries led by a certain Ulubatli Hassan discovered the open door and burst into the city. The Turks climbed onto the wall from the inside and raised the Sultan's green banner over the tower. Thousands of Turkish soldiers outside saw this banner, and they were seized by a frantic impulse. The janissaries climbed the walls with redoubled fury. The defense collapsed. The defenders fled to the harbor, hoping to escape on ships. The Turks broke into the city through the gates and breaches in the walls. The massacre began. The janissaries killed everyone they encountered, men, women, elderly. The streets filled with screams and groans. Mehmed entered the city around noon through the street Romanus gate. The Sultan stopped his horse, dismounted, and performed a prostration, thanking Allah for the victory. Then he mounted back and rode to the Hagia Sophia. Along the way, he ordered his soldiers to stop the killing. 3 days of looting had been promised, but the Sultan wanted to preserve the city intact. However, it was impossible to stop the enraged soldiers. Turks burst into houses, dragged out residents, took valuables, and killed those who resisted. Women and children were tied with ropes to be sold into slavery later. Churches were looted, gold casings stripped from icons, and tombs opened in search of treasures. Monks were killed right inside the temples. In the Hagia Sophia, several thousand people had gathered. They locked the massive bronze doors and prayed, hoping for a miracle. An ancient legend stated that when enemies entered the temple, an angel would descend from heaven and strike them down. But the miracle did not happen. The Turks broke the doors with axes and burst inside. They killed the priests serving the liturgy, looted the altar, and tore off gold and silver ornaments. The worshippers were tied and led into the courtyard, separated into groups for sale into slavery. Mehmed arrived at the cathedral around 3:00 p.m. He ascended the ambo, where Byzantine emperors had stood for 1,000 years during coronations, and ordered a Muslim prayer to be performed. The Hagia Sophia became a mosque. By evening on May 29, resistance had ceased. The last defenders had died or surrendered. The Venetian and Genoese ships, on which about 3,000 people managed to escape, sailed into the open sea, breaking the blockade. On one of them was the wounded Giustiniani. He died of his wounds on June 1 on the island of Chios. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos died in battle, and his body was never found. The Byzantine Empire, which had existed for 1,123 years, ceased to exist. On May 30, the city awoke under the rule of new masters. The streets were littered with corpses. By some estimates, about 4,000 defenders and residents perished on the first day of the storm. Janissaries and Bashi bazooks went house to house, dragging out those who had hidden. Families were tied with ropes, 10 to 15 people chained together. These chains of captives were driven to the markets, where they were sorted for sale into slavery. Young women and girls were separated for the harems of Turkish commanders. Children were taken to be trained for the Janissary Corps, or sold to wealthy families. Mehmed established his headquarters in the old imperial palace at Blachernay. The palace had been looted and partially destroyed, but Notaras ordered the throne room to be cleaned. He sat on the throne of the Byzantine emperors and received reports from commanders about the trophies. Viziers reported on captured treasures, gold, silver, precious stones, church plate. However, the wealth turned out to be less than expected. Constantinople had long since ceased to be a prosperous city. Centuries of wars, the plague of the 15th century, and Venetian and Genoese competition had drained the once wealthiest center of trade. The main booty turned out to be people. According to historians' estimates, 50,000 to 60,000 residents were led into slavery. Now, the majority of this population had become commodities at slave markets. Prices for slaves fell due to the surplus of supply. A young girl could be bought for the price of a pair of boots. A child was exchanged for a cap. An old person was worth nothing. They were simply killed as useless. The nobility and the rich were captured alive for ransom by the Turks. Lucas Notaras, the Grand Duke, was found in his palace together with his family. The 8-year-old official did not try to flee. He was brought to Mehmed. The Sultan received Notaras with honors, remembering that he had been the chief opponent of the union with the Catholics. Mehmed even offered Notaras a position in the city's new administration. But 2 days later, an incident occurred that cost the Grand Duke his life. The Sultan demanded his 14-year-old son for his harem. The old man refused. Mehmed ordered both father and son executed. They were beheaded along with Notaras's son-in-law. Cardinal Isidore managed to escape by dressing in the rags of a beggar. He was found among the captives and not recognized. The Italian prelate spent several days in the crowd of slaves until a Genoese merchant recognized and bought him. Then, Isidore secretly reached a Genoese ship and fled to Crete. Many aristocrats were not so lucky. They were killed on the spot or sold into slavery, without distinction of rank. Byzantine nobility, whose ancestors had ruled the empire for centuries, ended up in the slave markets of Bursa and Edirne. Turkish soldiers looted the city methodically. They knew they had 3 days by Sharia law, the traditional period for looting a city taken by storm. Warriors burst into churches, monasteries, and palaces. Icons were torn from walls, gold casings stripped, and the images themselves were broken or burned. From the mosaics, gold cubes were pried out. Marble columns and statues were broken to melt down bronze decorations. In the Kora monastery, Janissaries destroyed famous mosaics, trying to extract gold. In the Church of the Holy Apostles, they opened the emperor's tombs in search of treasures. The libraries suffered especially. Constantinople had been a repository of ancient wisdom. It housed thousands of manuscripts of ancient Greek and Roman authors, Byzantine chronicles, and theological treatises. Many of these texts existed in single copies. The Turkish soldiers, not understanding the value of books, tore them, burned them, and used parchment for household needs. Thousands of priceless manuscripts perished in 3 days. What European fugitives managed to save became the basis for the libraries of the Italian Renaissance. On June 1, Mehmed ordered the looting to stop. 3 days had elapsed, and the Sultan wanted to restore order. Heralds rode through the streets, announcing the ruler's will. The warriors obeyed reluctantly. Many had managed to get rich, some with a sack of gold coins, some with a chain of slaves, some with church plate. Officers collected 1/5 of all booty for the Sultan's treasury, as required by law. The soldiers could keep the rest. A grandiose sale of stolen goods began at improvised markets. Mehmed toured the city, inspecting his new capital. The Sultan was shocked by the destruction. Entire districts lay in ruins. Many houses stood empty. Their residents were dead or sold into slavery. The city's population had shrunk tenfold. Mehmed realized he had won the battle but had received a dead city. He immediately issued a decree on repatriation. All residents who had managed to flee were invited to return under security guarantees. Those who returned were promised the return of their houses and property. Also, the Sultan ordered the resettlement of people from other cities of the empire to Constantinople. The Sultan appointed a new Orthodox patriarch. The previous patriarch had died shortly before the siege, and the see was vacant. Mehmed chose the scholar monk Gennadios Scholarios, known for his intransigence toward the Catholics. Scholarios had spent his final years in a monastery, refusing to recognize the Florentine Union. Now, the Turkish Sultan was making him the head of the Orthodox Church. It was a shrewd political move. Mehmed gave the Greeks to understand that under Turkish rule they could preserve their faith, which the Catholics would not have permitted. On June 2, in the Hagia Sophia, already turned into a mosque, the enthronement ceremony of Gennadios took place. The Sultan personally handed the new patriarch a staff and a charter guaranteeing the rights of the Orthodox Church. By an irony of fate, the Orthodox hierarch received power from the hands of a Muslim ruler in a building where Christian emperors had been crowned for 1,000 years. Gennadios accepted the appointment with a heavy heart, but understood it was the only way to preserve orthodoxy under Turkish rule. Mehmed ordered the restoration of the city to begin. He wanted to make Constantinople, or Istanbul, as the Turks began to call it, the capital of the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan ordered the walls repaired, the streets cleared of debris, and the aqueducts that supplied the city with water restored. This required labor. Thousands of masters, masons, carpenters, plumbers were driven from all over the empire. They began to build mosques, madrasas, baths, and caravanserais. The Byzantine city was gradually turning into a Turkish one. The Hagia Sophia underwent alterations. The altar and throne were removed. Mosaics depicting Christ and the saints were plastered over, as Islam forbade the depiction of living beings. A mihrab was installed, pointing toward Mecca, and a minbar was erected for sermons. Later, 4 minarets were added to the building. The greatest cathedral of the Christian world became the main mosque of the Ottoman Empire. This symbolized the final victory of Islam over Byzantium. The Greek population remaining in the city was squeezed into a few quarters. The Fener district, near the northern wall, became the center of the Greek community. Here, the patriarch settled with his court. Greeks could practice orthodoxy but paid a special tax, the jizya. This tax on non-Muslims was one of the main sources of income for the Ottoman Empire. Christians were second-class citizens. They could not serve in the army, hold high positions, or carry weapons, but they were tolerated as useful subjects. The Genoese Galata retained its autonomy. The Podesta concluded an agreement with Mehmed. The colony recognized the Sultan's authority and paid tribute but retained self-government and trading privileges. Genoese merchants continued to do business, now with Turkish authorities. The Venetians also secured a trade treaty. Pragmatic Italian republics quickly adapted to the new reality. For them, profit was more important than religious solidarity with the Greeks. By the end of June, the city began to return to life. Markets and shops opened. Ships again called at the harbor. Mehmed encouraged trade, understanding that the city's wealth depended on commerce. Constantinople had always been a crossroads between Europe and Asia, between the Black and Mediterranean seas. This advantageous position remained regardless of who ruled it. The Turkish Istanbul continued the traditions of Byzantine Constantinople as a great trading center. The news of the fall of Constantinople spread through Europe with the speed of a forest fire. The first fugitives arrived in Venice on the 8th of June, 1453. The Venetian Senate heard tales of the storming, the massacre, and the looting from people who had miraculously escaped on ships. The senators listened to the report in grave silence. Many understood the Republic had lost an important ally and trading partner. Venice had extensive holdings in the eastern Mediterranean. Crete, Cyprus, the Aegean Islands. Now they were all under threat. Pope Nicholas V received the news on June 15. The aging pontiff, who dreamed of a crusade to save Byzantium, was shocked. He declared 3 days of mourning and ordered requiem masses to be served in all churches of Rome. The Pope immediately sent letters to the Christian sovereigns of Europe, calling for a crusade to retake Constantinople. But European kings were busy with their own wars. England and France were ending the 100 Years' War. Germany was torn by internal strife. Spain was at war with the Moors. No one wanted to expend strength on a distant eastern campaign. In Hungary, the news caused panic. The kingdom bordered Ottoman lands and was the first that could be attacked. Regent John Hunyadi, a famous commander who had beaten the Turks many times, understood the danger. He urgently strengthened the border, gathered troops, and called on neighbors for an alliance. But Hungary was weakened by previous wars and internal turmoil. Alone, it could not stop the Turkish expansion. Hunyadi appealed to the Pope and the Emperor for help but received only promises and prayers. In Rus, the news of the fall of Constantinople shocked society. In the 15th century, Moscow considered itself a younger relative of Byzantium, having accepted the Orthodox faith from it. The Moscow Grand Princes had intermarried with the Byzantine imperial house. In the Muslim world, the victory was met with jubilation. Mehmed became a hero of Islam, fulfilling the prophecy of the conquest of Constantinople. The Sultan received the honorary title Fatih, the conqueror. Congratulations came from across the Islamic world. The Mamluk Sultan of Egypt sent rich gifts. The Emir of Tunisia offered a military alliance. The Shah of Persia expressed respect. Although the Persians were Shiites and the Turks Sunnis, the Ottoman Empire turned into the leading power of the Islamic world. Mehmed did not stop there. In subsequent years, he conquered most of the Balkan Peninsula. Serbia fell in 1459, Bosnia in 1463, Albania in 1479. The Crimean Khanate recognized vassal dependence on Turkey. Turkish armies reached the walls of Vienna, although they failed to take the Austrian capital. The Ottoman Empire transformed into a superpower controlling 3 continents. For the Greeks, the fall of Constantinople became a national tragedy. The capital, which had stood for 1,123 years, the symbol of Byzantine civilization, turned into a Turkish city. The Greek population receded into the background. Hellenism, which had dominated this region for 2,000 years, since the time of Alexander the Great, retreated before the Turkic element. The Greeks preserved their language, faith, and culture, but lost their statehood. Only 400 years later, in the 19th century, would they gain independence. The last remnants of the Byzantine Empire fell within 10 years. Mistras in the Peloponnese, ruled by the brothers of the last emperor, capitulated in 1460. Thomas Palaiologos fled to Italy with his family, including his little daughter Sophia. Demetrios Palaiologos surrendered to the Turks and received a few villages as a fief, where he lived out his days in obscurity. The Empire of Trebizond on the southern shore of the Black Sea held out until 1461. Its last emperor, David Komnenos, was executed along with his entire family by Mehmed's order. The Byzantine imperial line was completely extinguished. The intellectual legacy of Byzantium was preserved thanks to emigrants. Cardinal Bessarion, a Greek by birth who moved to Italy before the fall of Constantinople, assembled a huge library of Greek manuscripts. After his death, it became the basis for the Bibliotheca Marciana in Venice. Manuel Chrysoloras taught Greek to Florentine humanists. George of Trebizond taught in Rome. These people passed on the ancient heritage that Byzantium had guarded to the west. The fall of Constantinople stimulated the search for new trade routes. The traditional Silk Road through Asia Minor was now controlled by the Turks, who imposed high tariffs. European merchants looked for alternative routes. Portuguese navigators began to explore a way to India around Africa. Christopher Columbus set off to the west, trying to reach Asia via the Atlantic, and discovered America. The age of discovery at the end of the 15th century was partly a consequence of Turkish control over the eastern Mediterranean. Military lessons from the siege were studied by commanders of the following centuries. Using heavy artillery to destroy fortress walls became standard tactic. Medieval castles and cities with high stone walls became obsolete. The era of bastion fortification began low. Thick walls capable of withstanding cannon fire. Military affairs changed radically. Knightly cavalry gave way to infantry with firearms. Urban's cannons opened a new era in the history of warfare. Religious consequences were also significant. The fall of Constantinople showed the weakness of the Christian world before Islam. This intensified reformist sentiments in Europe. Many Christians wondered why God allowed the destruction of the greatest Christian city. Critics of the church pointed to the moral decay of the clergy, the sale of indulgences, and the luxury of the papal court. 64 years later, Martin Luther would nail his theses to the doors of the Wittenberg Church, starting the Reformation. Economically, the Ottoman Empire flourished. Control over the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits yielded huge revenues from trade duties. Istanbul turned into a cosmopolitan city where Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and Italians lived. Sultans encouraged the immigration of craftsmen and merchants. After the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, tens of thousands of Sephardim found refuge in Turkey. They brought capital and trade ties, enriching the empire. The Ottoman system of government combined Turkish, Persian, and Byzantine traditions. Mehmed preserved many Byzantine institutions, adapting them to Islamic norms. The administrative division into provinces, eyalets, resembled the Byzantine themes. The taxation system largely mirrored the Byzantine one. Even the palace ceremonies of the Ottoman sultans borrowed elements of Byzantine court etiquette. Constantinople died as a Christian city, but Istanbul continued its traditions under Turkish rule. Giovanni Giustiniani Longo died of his wounds on the island of Chios in early June 1453. The Genoese condottiero, who defended Constantinople so valiantly, did not survive the chest wound. He was buried on Chios with military honors. The Genoese Republic declared him a hero. Giustiniani's family was one of the noblest in Genoa, and his death was mourned throughout Italy. His name remained in history as a symbol of courage and devotion to duty. Constantine XI Palaiologos became the last Byzantine emperor and a national hero for the Greeks. His body was never found among the thousands of dead. A multitude of legends arose. Some said he was turned into a marble statue and hidden under the city, waiting for the hour to rise and free Constantinople. Others claimed he was buried secretly and his grave lay somewhere in the city. Others believed he did not die but fled and lived in exile. The Greek Orthodox Church honors Constantine as a martyr. who died for the faith. Mehmed II lived for another 28 years after the capture of Constantinople. The Sultan continued his conquests, expanding the empire to unseen proportions. He captured Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, part of Hungary, and the Crimea, and subjugated the Empire of Trebizond and the Duchy of Athens. He fought with Venice, taking away a number of its islands. Twice he tried to take the island of Rhodes, where the Knights Hospitaller were located, but unsuccessfully. Mehmed died in 1481 at the age of 49 under mysterious circumstances. He may have been poisoned. The Sultan was an extraordinary personality. He spoke Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin, and even some Slavic languages. He patronized the arts and sciences, assembled a huge library, and invited European artists to his court. The Italian Gentile Bellini painted his portrait. Mehmed took an interest in ancient philosophy, read the biographies of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, and dreamed of conquering Rome and uniting East and West under his rule. He did not succeed. Death caught him during preparations for a campaign into Italy. Gennadios Scholarios, who became Patriarch of Constantinople by Mehmed's will, served in this post for only 4 years. He could not reconcile himself to the position of head of a church dependent on a Muslim ruler. In 1457, Gennadios abdicated the patriarchate and retired to a monastery, where he spent the rest of his life in prayer and literary work. His writings against Catholicism and the Union were popular among Orthodox Greeks. Scholarios died around 1472 at a great age. Lucas Notaras and his family perished tragically. After the execution of the Grand Duke and his son, the Turks killed Notaras's younger son and other relatives. The family, which had managed the empire's finances for several generations, was destroyed in a single day. The Notaras' estate was confiscated for the Sultan's treasury. The palace was looted by janissaries. Notaras's only daughter was sold into the harem of a Turkish pasha, where she died of illness a few years later. The most noble house of Byzantium vanished without a trace. The emperor's brothers met different fates. Thomas Palaiologos fled from the Peloponnese to Italy with his family. The Pope provided him with refuge and maintenance. Thomas died in Rome in 1465. His daughter, Sophia Palaiologina, married Grand Prince Ivan III of Moscow in 1472. She brought Byzantine traditions to Moscow, the double-headed eagle as a coat of arms, and court ceremonies. Through Sophia, the Byzantine legacy passed to the Russian state. Demetrios Palaiologos, the emperor's other brother, chose to surrender to the Turks. Mehmed spared him, giving him a small region in Thrace to rule, where he lived until 1,470 inches relative prosperity, though without power. Before death, he took monastic vows under the name David. His children were less lucky. The Sultan took them to his court, converted them to Islam, and included them in the Janissary Corps. The last Palaiologoi dissolved among the Turks, forgetting their origin. Venetian and Genoese merchants who escaped from Constantinople returned to trade. Many of them concluded new agreements with the Turkish authorities a few years later, and again did business in Istanbul. Commerce knows no religious boundaries. Italian republics quickly adapted to the new reality. Venice even entered an alliance with Turkey against common enemies. Pragmatism triumphed over ideology. Money proved more important than crosses or crescents. Ordinary residents of Constantinople who fell into slavery scattered throughout the Ottoman Empire and beyond. Young women were bought for harems. Children were taken for the janissary service or sold to wealthy families. Craftsmen were valued for their skill. Byzantine glassblowers, jewelers, and weavers were famous throughout the East. They were bought by Turkish grandees and sent to work in their workshops. Scientists and scribes were acquired for libraries and chanceries. Some captives managed to buy their freedom. Wealthy relatives in Europe collected money and paid the Turks. This was an extensive trade. Special agents traveled between Europe and Turkey, searching for captives and negotiating ransoms. The church organized charitable collections to free Christians from bondage. Venetian and Genoese merchants engaged in this as a profitable business. Over the 20 years after the fall of Constantinople, several thousand Greeks returned from slavery. Orthodox clergy continued their service under Turkish rule. Sultans patronized the church, seeing the patriarch as a useful intermediary for managing the Greek population. The patriarch was responsible not only for religious but also for civil matters of the Greeks. He collected taxes, settled disputes, and appointed officials. Effectively, Greeks lived as an autonomous community within the empire. This millet system religious communities persisted in Turkey until the 20th century. Baltaoğlu Süleyman Bey, the Turkish admiral beaten by Mehmed's order after the failure with the Christian ships, was expelled from the army and stripped of all property. He died in poverty a few years later, forgotten by all. His replacement by another admiral showed the cruelty of the Ottoman system. Defeat was punished mercilessly, but victory was rewarded generously. Ulubatli Hasan, the Janissary who first raised the Turkish flag on the wall, received a huge reward and was appointed governor of a wealthy province. Greek scholars who fled to Italy became the founders of humanistic studies. They taught Greek language and ancient literature at the universities of Florence, Rome, Padua, and Bologna. Thanks to them, Europeans read Homer, Plato, Aristotle, and the Greek dramatists in the original. Before this, the West knew antiquity mainly through Latin translations, often inaccurate. Byzantine immigrants gave the Renaissance direct access to the Greek heritage. This was their contribution to European civilization, a kind of revenge for their lost homeland. Some Greeks made careers at the Turkish court. Capable young men, converted to Islam, climbed the career ladder. The Devshirme system, the recruitment of Christian boys for the Janissary Corps, provided a social lift. Many great viziers of the Ottoman Empire in the 15th and 16th centuries were Christians from the Balkans by origin. They forgot their native language and faith, becoming Turks. This was a tragic paradox. Descendants of the defenders of Constantinople served the sultans who had conquered their homeland. The Aegean Islands, which remained under Venetian or Genoese control, became a refuge for Greek fugitives. Crete, Rhodes, Corfu, and Chios preserved Hellenic culture. Here, chronicles were written in Greek, ancient manuscripts were copied, and icon painting workshops operated. When the Turks conquered another island, the Greeks moved to another, still free one. These times ended only in the 19th century, when Greeks gained independence. Historical memory of the fall of Constantinople persisted for centuries. Greeks passed down stories of the empire's final days from generation to generation. Songs about the heroic Emperor Constantine were sung in villages. Legends of hidden treasures stirred the imagination. Predictions of a return. When the time comes, the city will be ours again, sustained hope. May 29 became a day of national mourning, marked by secret services in churches. The Byzantine Empire, which had lasted 1,123 years, left a huge legacy. From a small Roman town, Byzantium, founded by Greek colonists in the 6th century BC, to a great Christian power controlling the Mediterranean, a path of 1,500 years. In 330 AD, Constantine the Great moved the capital of the Roman Empire to Byzantium and renamed the city Constantinople. From that moment began the history of the Eastern Roman Empire, which later historians would call Byzantium. The Byzantines called themselves Romaioi Romans. They considered themselves the direct successors of the Roman Empire, although they spoke Greek and practiced Christianity. This dual identity, Roman statehood and Greek culture, defined Byzantine civilization. To this was added a third element, Orthodox Christianity. This triad, Roman law, Greek philosophy, Christian faith, created a unique culture, unlike either ancient Rome or classical Greece. In its best times, the empire stretched from Gibraltar to Mesopotamia, from the Danube to Egypt. Under Emperor Justinian I in the 6th century, Byzantium controlled almost the entire Mediterranean basin. Justinian reconquered Italy, North Africa, and part of Spain from the barbarians. He built the Hagia Sophia and codified Roman law in the famous Corpus Juris Civilis. Byzantium was the restored Roman Empire in all its majesty. But half a century after Justinian's death, decline began. The Arab conquests of the 7th century stripped the empire of its richest provinces. Syria, Egypt, and North Africa fell under the onslaught of Muslim armies. Byzantium lost 3/4 of its territory and income. The emperors reorganized the remaining lands into military districts, creating a system that lasted 400 years. The empire survived but was no longer a world power. It turned into a Greek state, preserving Roman traditions and the Christian faith. The 9th and 10th centuries became a time of new prosperity. Emperors of the Macedonian dynasty returned some of the lost lands to the empire. Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, conquered Bulgaria and expanded the borders to the Danube. The Byzantine army was again considered the best in the world. Constantinople was the largest and richest city in Europe with a population of 500,000. Trade flourished, crafts developed, and arts and sciences reached a high level. It seemed Byzantium would survive for ages. But in 1071, a catastrophe occurred at Manzikert. The Seljuk Turks routed the Byzantine army and captured Emperor Romanos IV. Asia Minor, the heart of the empire, the source of soldiers and bread, was open to Turkish raids. Over 50 years, Turkic nomads settled the Anatolian plateau, displacing the Greek population. Byzantium lost its main recruitment base. Henceforth, emperors had to hire mercenaries, Varangians, Normans, Pechenegs. The army was expensive and not always reliable. The Crusades dealt the empire a blow no less than the Turkish invasions. Formally, the Crusaders went to liberate the Holy Land from the Muslims, and Byzantium was their ally. In reality, Western knights looted Byzantine lands, captured cities, and created their own principalities. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 ended in the storming of Constantinople by the Crusaders. The Venetians and French barons looted the capital, destroyed priceless treasures, and burned libraries. In place of the Byzantine Empire, a Latin one arose. Existing for 57 years, Greeks returned to Constantinople in 1261, but the empire was already a shadow of its former greatness. From the vast power, there remained scattered areas around the capital, in Thessaloniki, and in the Peloponnese. The Venetians and Genoese controlled the islands and trade. Serbs and Bulgarians created independent kingdoms, and from the east approached a new threat, the Ottoman Turks, who had turned a small beylik in Bithynia into a mighty state over 100 years. Byzantium was slowly dying, and everyone knew it. The empire's last 2 centuries were a struggle for survival. The Palaiologos emperors debased themselves before Western sovereigns, begging for help, agreeing to a union with the Catholic Church, which provoked the fury of the Orthodox population. They sold off their last treasures to hire mercenaries, played Turkish claimants to the throne against each other, and maneuvered between Ottoman princes. It was a pathetic agony of a once great power. When Mehmed II approached Constantinople, the empire consisted of only the city and the ghost of its former greatness. But even while dying, Byzantium gave much to the world. Its lawyers preserved and systematized Roman law, which became the basis of the European legal system. Justinian's code was studied in the universities of medieval Europe and influences legislation to this day. Byzantine legal concepts, the presumption of innocence, the right to defense, the distinction between civil and criminal law entered modern jurisprudence. The Roman legal tradition survived thanks to Byzantine compilations. In the realm of religion, Byzantium created Eastern Christianity orthodoxy. The 7 ecumenical councils, held in Byzantine cities from the 4th to the 8th century, formulated the basic dogmas. Debates about the nature of Christ, the Trinity, and the veneration of icons were resolved at these councils. The great church fathers Basil the Great, Gregory of Nazianzus, John Chrysostom lived and created in Byzantium. Orthodox worship, iconography, and monasticism were formed in the Byzantine tradition. Through Byzantium, Christianity came to the Slavs, Bulgarians, Serbs, and Russians. Byzantine art created a distinct aesthetic: mosaics of the cathedrals of Constantinople, frescoes of the monasteries of Cappadocia and Mount Athos, icons of the capital's masters. All these are treasures of world culture. The Byzantine style influenced Western medieval art, Islamic art, and Russian icon painting. The image of Christ Pantocrator, the Mother of God Hodegetria, the composition of the Last Judgment, all these are Byzantine iconographic schemes still used today. The gold background of icons, reverse perspective, and symbolism of color, the contribution of Byzantine masters to world art, is inestimable. In architecture, Byzantium created the type of cross-in-square church, which became the basis of Orthodox church construction. The Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, with its huge dome hovering 40 meters above the floor, remained the largest domed structure in the world for 1,000 years. The technical solutions of Byzantine architects, the system of pendentives transferring the weight of the dome to 4 supports, were used by builders of subsequent centuries. Russian churches with their onion domes developed the Byzantine tradition. Byzantine diplomacy was an art that all its neighbors studied. The imperial court in Constantinople developed a complex system of relations with barbarian kingdoms. Money, titles, dynastic marriages, bribing tribal leaders, playing one enemy against another, all these were tools of Byzantine foreign policy. The term Byzantine diplomacy became synonymous with cunning and deviousness. Byzantines preferred to win through intrigue, not war. This allowed for saving strength but created a reputation for deceitful hypocrites. The economy of Byzantium was based on trade. Constantinople was the crossroads of trade routes between Europe and Asia. Through it flowed silk from China, spices from India, furs from Rus, and amber from the Baltics. Byzantine merchants traded from Britain to Persia. The gold coin of Byzantium, the solidus, was an international currency recognized from Ireland to Arabia. The stability of the Byzantine monetary system was astonishing. The solidus maintained its weight and purity for 700 years, from the 4th to the 10th century. No other currency in history has shown such stability. Byzantine crafts were famous all over the world. Silk production, the secret of which was stolen from the Chinese in the 6th century, yielded huge profits. Byzantine fabrics, brocade with gold embroidery, and purple silks were valued at their weight in gold. Glassblowers created products of surprising beauty. Jewelers produced jewelry that had no equals. Armor makers forged blades into which gold and silver were inlaid. Icon painters created images covered with precious casings. All this was exported and brought huge revenues to the treasury. When the Turks took Constantinople in 1453, they inherited not just a city. They received the capital of a civilization that had accumulated a millennium of experience. The Ottoman Empire adopted much from Byzantium. The administrative system, diplomatic methods, even elements of court etiquette. Istanbul continued Constantinople's role as a global center of trade and culture. Byzantium died, but its legacy lived on in new forms. The fall of Constantinople changed the balance of power in Europe forever. The Ottoman Empire transformed into a superpower that threatened the Christian world. Over the next 200 years, the Turks tried 3 times to take Vienna, the capital of the Holy Roman Empire. The first siege in 1529 failed due to an early winter and the courage of the defenders. The second, in 1683, ended in the defeat of the Turks by the combined forces of the Holy Roman Empire and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Ottoman expansion was stopped, but the fear of the Turks defined European politics for centuries. The idea of the Reconquista, the retaking of Constantinople, never left the Christian sovereigns. Projects for crusades against the Turks were developed in the 15th-18th centuries. Popes regularly called for holy war, but European kings were busy with wars against each other. The Reformation split Europe into Catholics and Protestants. The religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries bled the continent dry. No one could gather the strength for a big campaign to the east. Venice fought with Turkey for almost 200 years. The Republic lost most of its eastern possessions. Cyprus fell in 1570 after the heroic defense of Famagusta. Crete in 1669 after a 24-year war. The Venetians occasionally took revenge. In 1687 they even captured Athens. But for long, the naval battle at Lepanto in 1571, where the combined Christian fleet routed the Turks, was considered a great victory, but strategically it changed nothing. Turkish dominance in the eastern Mediterranean continued. The Muscovite state saw itself as the successor to Byzantium after the fall of Constantinople. The idea of Moscow as the Third Rome, formulated by the monk Philotheus in the 16th century, became the ideological basis of the Muscovite tsardom. Ivan III married Sophia Palaiologina, niece of the last Byzantine emperor, and adopted the Byzantine double-headed eagle as the coat of arms. The Muscovite grand princes, and then the czars, considered themselves protectors of orthodoxy and laid claim to the Byzantine inheritance. The wars of the Russian Empire with Turkey in the 18th-19th centuries were partly motivated by the desire to liberate Constantinople and restore the Christian Empire. Catherine II nurtured a grandiose Greek project to plan to partition the Ottoman Empire and create a new Byzantine state under Russian protectorate. She even named one of her grandsons Constantine, intending to make him the emperor of the revived Byzantium. The Russo-Turkish wars of the 1770s, 1790s, and 19th century brought the Russian Empire control over the Black Sea and the Crimea. Russian troops reached the Danube, but Constantinople remained unreachable. European powers did not allow the strengthening of the Russian Empire in the Balkans. In the 19th century, the decline of the Ottoman Empire began. The sick man of Europe was what Turkey was called. The Greeks were the first to revolt for independence. The War of 1829 ended with the creation of an independent Greek kingdom. Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria followed Greece, freeing themselves from the Turkish yoke. Throughout the 19th century, the Balkan Peninsula, which had been under Ottoman control for 400 years, returned to independence, but Constantinople remained Turkish. The First World War gave Greece a chance to reclaim the ancient capital. The Ottoman Empire fought on Germany's side and was defeated. Under the terms of the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, Turkey lost almost all its European possessions. The Greek army landed in Asia Minor and moved deep into the territory. Greek Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos dreamed of a great Greece that included Constantinople and the western coast of Anatolia. The dream seemed close to realization, but the Turkish Revolution under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk changed everything. Turkish nationalists rejected the Treaty of Sèvres and launched a war. The Greek army was routed in 1922. A population exchange followed. 500,000 Greeks left Asia Minor, where their ancestors had lived for 3,000 years, and moved to Greece. 500,000 Turks moved from Greece to Turkey. It was a humanitarian catastrophe, but it put an end to centuries of mixed living. Constantinople remained Turkish, although a significant Greek minority lived there until the 1950s. The Turkish Republic, created by Ataturk in 1923, broke with the Ottoman past. The Sultanate was abolished, the Caliphate liquidated. Turkey became a secular state. Constantinople was officially renamed Istanbul, a name Turks had used for centuries, but only now did it become official. The Hagia Sophia, which had served as a mosque for 600 years, was turned into a museum in 1935. Ataturk wanted to show that the new Turkey respected all religions and was a bridge between East and West. In the 20th century, interest in Byzantium revived among historians. For a long time, Western science neglected the Byzantine period, considering it a decline after the greatness of classical antiquity. Edward Gibbon, in his famous History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, written in the 18th century, portrayed Byzantium as a degrading despotism. Only in the 20th century did scholars begin a reassessment. The works of Stephen Runciman, Dmitry Obolensky, and Alexander Kazdan showed Byzantium as a complex, developed civilization that made a huge contribution to world culture. Archaeological excavations in Istanbul opened up a multitude of Byzantine monuments. The mosaics of the Kora Monastery, discovered under layers of plaster, amazed art historians with their beauty and skill. Underground cisterns, aqueducts, and the remains of imperial palaces, all this was studied and restored. The Turkish government, understanding the tourist value of the Byzantine heritage, financed the research. Istanbul became an open-air museum where Roman, Byzantine, and Ottoman monuments coexist. The Greek diaspora around the world preserved the memory of Constantinople. May 29 remained a day of mourning when requiems for the fallen empire were served in Greek churches. Legends of the marble emperor who would wake up and return the city were passed from generation to generation. Greek poets wrote of the lost homeland, the walls of Constantinople, and the Hagia Sophia. Constantine Cavafy, the greatest Greek poet of the 20th century, dedicated many poems to Byzantium, singing of its greatness and mourning its demise. In Greece, the issue of Constantinople remained painful. Officially, no one made territorial claims. Modern Greece recognized the borders established after the Second World War, but in the hearts of many Greeks lived the dream of returning to their historical capital. The phrase "the city," capitalized, meant only Constantinople for the Greeks, even though it had long been the Turkish Istanbul. This nostalgia for the lost city was part of Greek national identity. The Orthodox Church maintained a special relationship with Constantinople. The ecumenical patriarch still has his residence in Istanbul in the Fener district. He is considered the first among equals among Orthodox patriarchs. Although his flock in Turkey has shrunk to a few thousand people, the Constantinople See holds titular primacy in the Orthodox world, a memory of the times when Constantinople was the center of Eastern Christianity. Each patriarch, ascending the throne, realizes the 1,000-year tradition linking him to the great hierarchs of the past. In 2020, the Turkish government again turned the Hagia Sophia into a mosque. The decision provoked protests in the Christian world and among historians. UNESCO expressed concern. Greece condemned it as an insult to world cultural heritage, but Turkey had the sovereign right to dispose of buildings on its territory. The Hagia Sophia, moving from church to mosque, to museum, and back to mosque, symbolized the complex history of Constantinople Istanbul, a city where Christianity and Islam, Europe and Asia, the past and the present have intertwined. 572 years have passed since that May morning when Turkish troops burst into Constantinople. Over these centuries, the world has changed beyond recognition. The empires that existed in 1453 have long since vanished. The Ottoman power, which seemed invincible, disintegrated after the First World War. Venice and Genoa, once great maritime republics, turned into ordinary Italian cities. Byzantium became a subject of study for historians. Looking back, one is struck by the disunity of Europe in the face of a common threat. European states did not help Constantinople, although they understood that after its fall the Turks would come for them. Venice traded with the Ottomans. Genoa maintained neutrality. Hungary was occupied with internal affairs, and the Pope gave speeches but sent no troops. Everyone thought of their own interests. As a result, everyone lost. The Turks captured the Balkans, threatened Italy, and controlled trade routes. Divided, they fell one by one, as Emperor Constantine predicted in his final letters to Western sovereigns. Historians still debate what might have been. What if the West had sent help? If Giustiniani had not been wounded at the decisive moment? If the Kirkoporta Gate had been locked that May morning? But what happened? Happened. Constantinople fell. Byzantium ceased to exist. The Ottoman Empire dominated the Balkans for 400 years. History does not know the subjunctive mood. The past cannot be changed. It can only be studied, trying to understand the logic of events and the relentlessness of time. In the end, the fall of Constantinople teaches us humility before history. Great empires collapse. Mighty cities change hands. Civilizations flourish and die. But life goes on. People are born, love, work, and die, regardless of who rules and what borders are drawn on maps. Byzantium is gone, but the Greek people live. The Ottoman Empire disintegrated, but the Turks created a new state.